Okay, we are finally ready to do some real ecology. Moving on from the variables thing, so no more constants, controls, and independent, dependent variable. Now we're actually moving on to some real ecology. So this should be a lot more fun than some of the things we've done so far this school year. So biomes. What are biomes or what is a biome? Well, a biome is an area or areas that share similar climate, topography, soil conditions, and life forms. In other words, these areas are the same because of two reasons. One, temperature, the other, the amount of precipitation. If you look at the video at the top with the penguins here, you'll see this is an area that's very cold. It's also an area that does have some moisture, does have some standing water, but overall doesn't receive a lot of water. That biome, which is called the tundra biome, is completely different than the video below where you see the snake fighting the squirrel-looking animal. The biome at the bottom is a desert biome. As you can see, it's very dry and there's really no water at all. And since these two areas have very different temperatures, one being cold, one being hot, and very different amounts of precipitation, one having quite a bit of water and the other one not having much at all, they are different biomes. They're very different in temperature and they're very different in how much moisture or how much water is in the area. And since there are these differences, you have different life forms. Not only the animals, but you also see the plants are different as well. So biomes are areas that share similar climate, topography, in other words, the land and what it's like, have different soil conditions, and more importantly, different life forms. And the reason why they have different life forms is there are varying amounts of temperature and precipitation among biomes. First biome we're going to discuss here is probably one you've heard of or you're very familiar with, and that's the desert biome. And the desert biome, as you know, has low precipitation, meaning there's not a whole lot of rain in the desert. But what's unique about a desert is there's actually wide changes in temperatures. Yes, deserts are very hot, but only during the day. At night, deserts are actually very cold. And since these areas have such variances in temperature, the animals have to adapt. Like I said, it's very hot during the day. It's very cold at night. And the reason why there's such these big changes in temperature is deserts, since there's not a whole lot of water, don't have many plants. So there's not any organisms to keep moisture and to keep heat, or in some cases the cool air, down on the ground. The air escapes very easily from these areas because there's no vegetation. So that causes the animals to have to adapt. In other words, they have to change their bodies to be used to a climate during the day that's very hot and at night is very cold. Another thing about deserts that's kind of a misconception is most people think that deserts are only made of sand. In actuality, most of the deserts on Earth are actually made of gravel, which are just small pieces of rock and rock itself. So although we often think, whether we see in a movie or maybe something we already think, that deserts are made of sand, most of them are gravel and rock. They're not sand. Like I had mentioned before, animals in these areas have to adapt. These are very harsh conditions because there's just not much water. And since these animals have to preserve water in their bodies so they don't die, they have to find ways to use their bodies to adapt to not having moisture. As you can see, the animal here, this very small fox, has adapted. It has very large ears. And the reason why it has large ears is it's adapted to its surroundings. Food is very scarce in the desert because there's just not much moisture, so there's not that many living organisms around. So these foxes have adapted to the dryness in their area by growing bigger ears so that they can hear their prey, so that they can stalk their prey, because if they get a chance to eat, they have to take advantage of it. They can't wait around for another opportunity. So animals have adapted to the dryness in the area to not only preserve body moisture, but also to help them to find food. Grasslands are called grasslands because they have grass. Grasslands have, like I said, a lot of grass. They also have flowering plants, but very few trees. They have distinct seasonal cycles, meaning in a grassland you're going to have a wide range of weather. You're going to have cold during the winter, very mild temperatures during the spring, very hot summers, and once again mild temperatures in the fall. So you have distinct seasons of summer, winter, spring, and fall. These are very good areas for farming, for growing plants such as wheat, corn, and oats. Grasslands are perfect because there's not a lot of big trees. And since you have your distinct seasonal cycles, you're always going to have a part of the year where you can grow food and that you can farm in. We should be very familiar with this because grasslands are here in the United States. Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, mainly the middle part of the United States is a big grassland. And so we live in a grassland here in the states of Kansas and Missouri. What's cool about grasslands is before humans came in, these areas used to contain these big herds of buffalo, a lot of wolves, deer, and then humans came in. We decided we were going to change the land to make farms. And when we did that, we invaded the homes of these animals and eventually, for the most part, wiped them out. Now, there's obviously still um, wolves and deer out there, but most of the buffalo you'll find are on farms or maybe contained in an area, whereas they used to roam free in this area. So we used to have a lot of wildlife just in the area, but now we don't because most of the areas we've converted for farming or maybe housing or businesses. So grasslands are where we live, a lot of grass, flowering plants, very few trees, very distinct seasonal cycles. Tundra is the next biome, and the tundra is usually in a very high mountainous area. And since these areas are very high in the air and they're mountainous, they often are very cold, very harsh. Most of the animals that live here have adapted to these cold, harsh, this cold, harsh environment in order to live. Because if they didn't adapt, they would not be able to live. And because this area is frozen for most of the year. And since it's frozen, since it's so cold, it's a very difficult place to live. You have very few life forms for most of the year. Birds, for the most part, are not found in these areas, but they do migrate to these areas during some seasons in order to live because it is cooler. But for the most part, since it's a very cold, harsh area, most birds have left the area, and only organisms such as these seals are able to survive these areas because seals and the other animals that live in these areas, such as polar bears, they migrate or leave. Excuse me, they migrate. In other words, they leave and fly away. Or these seals or polar bears will hibernate during the year. In other words, they'll go down in the snow or down in the ground and live for months on end underneath the ground or underneath the ice. But the tundra is very high, mountainous areas, very cold, harsh winters, really tough place for animals and life forms to live. And that's why you'll find very few life forms in these areas. Next biome is the conifer forest, or coniferous forest. Different scientists say it different ways. But these are forests which have very low precipitation. So there's a little bit more rain than, say, like a desert, but it's not a whole lot. And since there's not much rain, you have less moisture, which means you don't have big leaves on the trees. It's more like thin needle-like leaves and cones. In these areas are often where forest fires happen. Forest fires burn away dead plants and animals and trees and kind of recycle the forest. And after the fire, nutrients are left behind. So fire is actually very important to a conifer forest because it kind of burns away the dead stuff. Over time, trees, kind of like maybe in your yard at home, trees kind of shed their leaves, they shed their old branches, and fire in these areas is very important because it burns away the old stuff and actually leaves nutrients behind. So a conifer forest is a very unique forest because it's low precipitation, not a lot of moisture, and since it has very little moisture, you're going to have very thin, needle-like leaves in a conifer forest. The next forest is called a deciduous forest, and in a deciduous forest, you're going to have a lot of precipitation. In other words, a lot of rain, and whenever you have this, you're going to have bigger leaves. You're not going to have as many needles as leaves. You'll have big, full leaves, as you can see from the video right up here. Very green forest, and the reason why is there is a lot of moisture in these areas. Whenever you have a lot of moisture, you're going to have a lot of plants and a lot of trees. So deciduous forest is very different than a conifer forest. In a conifer forest, you don't get as much rain, and therefore you're going to have very thin, needle-like trees, which have cones because they just don't get enough precipitation. In a deciduous forest, you're going to have bigger leaves, bigger trees because you get more rain. The trees produce leaves during the growing season, unlike the cones in a conifer forest or the needles in a conifer forest, and they shed the leaves after the growing season. So like when we have fall here in Kansas City, the leaves shed, they fall down to the earth and are recycled by the earth, and this happens in a deciduous forest as well. After the leaves reach their full growth, they will shed and fall to the ground. One of the biggest problems in deciduous forests is that people cut down the trees for the timber, for the wood, to build houses and to use in other projects. Not as big of a problem here in the United States, but especially in other parts of the world. And whenever you take away an animal's habitat, as you can see what's happened here with this, it's actually a monkey. Whenever you have an area in which they wipe out the trees, you can see here they wipe the trees out. There's not many trees for this animal to live. His or her home's been destroyed, and eventually they don't have food. They can't find food, and eventually they will die, or the numbers will be significantly less. So timber harvesting in a deciduous forest is a real problem, mainly in other countries because we have laws governing this here in the United States, but in other countries they're not as educated, so they cut down a bunch of the trees and therefore they kill many of the animals around the area. Scrubs are very unique biomes. There's actually 3 of these: thorn, Mediterranean, and what's called a chaparral scrub. The thorn is a scrub, like as you can see up here at the top in the top video, very dry year-round, and since it's dry, you're going to have smaller plants. Not going to have a lot of trees and not a lot of green. It's going to be mainly dry. And if you can imagine Africa, that's what a thorn scrub is. There you find animals as well, such as gazelle, rhinos, and giraffe that like to live in these kind of drier, less rain areas. The next one is the middle one here. This is a Mediterranean scrub. You're going to have a little bit more precipitation. It's still going to be warm and dry, but you're going to have a little bit more precipitation. And since you have more precipitation, you're going to have more flowers, you're going to have smaller trees. But just like with a conifer forest, fires are very important in the Mediterranean scrub because they kind of burn away the dead stuff and allow the nutrients to enter back into the ground, which leads to more life. The final scrub is kind of a unique scrub. It's called the chaparral scrub. It's also dry, but you're going to have more moisture than a Mediterranean. But what's really cool, as you can see from the video below, you have very unique species of animals, such as jackrabbits, kangaroos, which you can see here. These are actually males that are fighting over a female. You're going to have some rats, some lizards, and some birds. You're going to have some very unique animals in a chaparral scrub because they get more moisture. Whenever you have more moisture, more rain, you're going to have more animals. You're going to have more trees, more vegetation, and a chaparral scrub has that. Whereas with a thorn scrub, like up here, you're going to have less vegetation overall, therefore less organisms overall because there's just not as much water. So chaparral scrub is very unique because it gets more water and you have very unique animals such as these kangaroos. Tropical moist forests are exactly what they say they are. They're very moist, very hot, lots of rain, about 80 inches per year on average with rain. And since you have a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, you're going to have a lot of life, whether it be plants, animals, insects. You're going to have a lot of life because the environment is so moist. You'll see these animals are very complex, meaning they have a lot of different colors. Maybe their body parts are a little bit different than what you would normally see, and it's because there's so much moisture in these areas. There are literally millions of insect types in a tropical moist forest. If you were to go to this area, you would be blown away by the amount of insects that are contained in these areas. Again, because there's a lot of moisture, there's a lot of precipitation. Whenever you have a lot of precipitation, you're going to have a lot of different types of organisms, especially insects. And just like with a deciduous forest, deforestation, in other words, clearing a forest by man is a major problem because whenever you cut down the trees and use the wood for other things such as building houses or maybe cities or using the wood for other projects, whenever you take out an organism's habitat, you're killing that organism off because they have nowhere to live, they have nowhere to go for protection, they have no place to find food, and it's very bad for organisms whenever man deforests an area. But again, not necessarily here in the United States. First of all, we don't really have tropical moist forests, but worldwide, deforestation is a problem because whenever you take an animal's habitat away, you also take, in many cases, its life as well. So tropical moist forest, very moist, very hot, a lot of life, millions of insects, but unfortunately in many areas around the world, deforestation is happening. Man is clearing the forests and therefore killing many of the animals that live in these areas. Our final biome is the tropical seasonal forest. What's cool about a tropical seasonal forest is, as it says in the name, it has seasons, meaning it has a wet season and a dry season. So the temperatures are hot year-round, but in one part of the year you're going to have hot, wet weather, and the other part of the year you're going to have a hot, dry weather. That's why it's called a tropical seasonal forest, because you have seasons. Excuse me. One is wet season, one is the dry season. And since you have a wet and a dry season, the animals and plants in the area have to be what's called drought resistant, meaning they have to be able to go through times where they have an abundance of water and times when they don't have any water. And they're called drought resistant because whenever you have a drought, you don't have water, so then these trees need to be able to live without water. Same with the plants and the animals. And this is an area in the world in which most of the people worldwide live. These are Africa, Asia, Australian areas, and a lot of people worldwide live in tropical seasonal forests. So people, along with the animals and plants, have to adapt as well for the wet season and the dry season. And once again, in tropical seasonal forests, as you can see from the video below, just not a lot of forest. And one of the reasons why is you have a dry season, which means there's not going to be a lot of rain, so therefore you're not going to have as many trees. But people have also wiped out 99% of the forest in some of these areas. So they have deforested many of these areas. And whenever you do that, once again, you not only affect the plants and the trees in the area, but you also affect the animals which use these trees to not only have places to live, but also places to find food. So tropical seasonal forests have seasons, unlike the tropical moist forest, which only has one season, which is moist and hot. This one it's always hot, but it has a very distinct wet season and a very distinct dry season. So tropical seasonal forests, our last biome for the biome section.